home is something that is safe and secure. Um, I was just thinking, like, as a transgender person, I maybe have am more likely to articulate some of those needs. Like if someone says, "Hey, I've got a great roommate for you," I'm going to ask different questions than maybe I would otherwise, right? Like I'm going to want to make sure that I am, welcome and able to be my whole self. And I think that's probably true for many people, not just trans folks and queer folks, but that everybody wants to be able to be who they are in their home. And so for me, that's really first and foremost. And I think like also, not just a place where you get your basic needs met, but a place where you can really kind of thrive. And so moving from survive to thrive, I think is important. Um, and to really, have the ability to create or be calm, like all those kind of things that, especially during COVID, I'm like, okay, these are actually really important. And maybe before, like, especially those of us who maybe had stable housing, like I didn't think about some of those things as much as I'm doing now. Like, all right, I need, some quiet in my house, or I need the ability to make music or something, like, or make art. Like all those things are more important maybe now than I was realizing before.
Homes Awry is a coalition of organizations working to ensure that everyone has a safe, healthy, and affordable home. Hopefully, these interviews will bring insights to the need and work and highlight where housing intersects with other issues and opportunities.
My name is Alex West. I'm a staff attorney at SouthCoast Fair Housing. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And SouthCoast Fair Housing serves Bristol and Plymouth counties in Massachusetts, and then the entire state of Rhode Island.
Yeah. What inspired you to start working in housing?
Well, when I graduated from college, so this is going to be a while ago, but I went and I did a year of service at it's called Plymouth House of Healing through Plymouth Healing Communities in Seattle. And it's a really an amazing kind of intentional space where folks who were hospitalized for like mental health, like acute mental health needs, and then were ready to leave the hospital but didn't have a place to go, could come and stay for even up to a year, like as long as they needed to kind of, I guess, readjust to the day-to-day life and not be released like out onto the streets, right? Because then we know it's really hard to like keep up with your medication or something like that if you're living on the streets. And just like the ability to welcome people into a really caring environment. We had a community meal every night. And so it was a really unique thing. There were 4 of us who were volunteers living in the house, and then 4 folks who were coming from the hospital living in the house. And I would say it was probably one of the best years of my life, even though there were challenges. Definitely hard. Some people who were there would have other emergencies come up or need to go back to the hospital, and definitely none of us were trained like mental health providers. So we were offering what we could, right? Like offering to share a meal, go for a walk, read a book together, watch TV together, like those kind of things. And so that really opened my eyes to what doesn't exist in terms of like, okay, we have this amazing space, but it's for 4 people, right? So just knowing that there's so much more need out there. And like, can we do things in non-traditional ways too? Like in terms of like not necessarily having clients and people who serve, but how are we, we're all in this together. So how can we respond to the different needs of community members when they have them, when we have needs, like, can we get those met? So really, it was a really fantastic experience. And it made me want to, look at other types of housing work. And then from there, I worked for a number of years at a kind of a transitional home for 18 to 22-year-olds who are queer and trans, or majority were queer and trans. And so that was a fantastic space too, and really kind of fun. But I was definitely like somebody who was working there as opposed to a community member. And that's really what prompted me to go to law school and to study, different housing needs and areas in housing. And I've really practiced kind of housing related or housing tangential law since then.
Cool. And so you went into law school with the intention of like doing this type of work?
Yeah, I didn't know exactly. Yeah, I didn't know exactly what I would be doing. And I had some great internships. I got to work at a place doing just Social Security law. So that kind of thing, like making sure people had their public benefits. And then I interned at the Sylvia Trans Law Project in New York, or Sylvia Rivera law project in New York, which is working specifically with transgender folks, especially a number of whom were incarcerated. So really seeing the gamut of, all right, there's, some community members need to have their, names changed or ID that matches who they are. But then also we have people in our community who are experiencing, kind of intense harms, like while they're incarcerated. And so needing to address like many different needs at once, of which housing is one, and sometimes the most important, right? Because if you don't have stable housing, it's hard to get your paperwork together to go get your name changed. So I think housing it's always been the thread through this work that I've been doing, and sometimes very focused. So right now doing fair housing, that's really just housing. So that's I've gotten more focused. Yeah.
Nice. Has did that work sort of like move you into fair housing? Were you like experiencing a lot of like stories of people who were being discriminated against?
Yeah, so I did a program called AmeriCorps Legal Advocates of Massachusetts for a year in at South Coastal County's Legal Services in Fall River, Massachusetts. And so that was, when I moved back to the East Coast, that was the job I had. And it was through there that I learned about South Coast Fair Housing and was able to refer some folks, because oftentimes when you're a legal aid attorney, you might spot some fair housing issues. But since you're very focused on putting out the fires, like working in eviction court and housing court, and trying to keep people like from not being moved out of their house like today, it's hard to take the time to say, wait a second, I think you have a fair housing claim. Obviously, sometimes we would raise them, but it was more often like, okay, I don't have the time to advocate for this person to say have their access needs met, like a wheelchair ramp, so I'm going to refer them to South Coast Fair Housing. So then I was, aware of the organization and then applied and was hired after my AmeriCorps year. So it was really great to already be familiar with the organization and be excited to say, look, if I have the time, these are the kind of issues I want to address. And it's nice to, the work in housing court is extremely important, and I'm thankful that there are people who are willing to do that day in and day out. And it's hard, right? Because you're always putting out fires. You're not able to maybe work on something more long-term or do any policy work, which we also get to do at South Coast Fair Housing.
Awesome. And can you just kind of briefly define fair housing?
Sure. So the definition that we always give, like in our presentations, is fair housing is the right of all people to be free from discrimination, whether it's in like the rental, sale, or financing of housing. But it really means like everybody should have the opportunity to buy or rent any home in any neighborhood of their choice. Obviously, right now anyway, with the barrier being, can they afford it? But that's it. It really means much more than the ability to not be discriminated against. It's also like you get to choose, right? Like what neighborhood you want your family to be able to live in, what type of housing you want. And so it's got some affirmative elements too, instead of just can't be discriminated against.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit about your role? Like you were just talking about how it's not putting out fires. It's sort of like it's got a more systemic perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, and sometimes there are fires. So
yeah.
If somebody's being evicted and we learn that the underlying reason is like discriminatory, for example, oh, we found out you are pregnant and we can't have children in the house, so you have to leave. We're going to jump right in and try to stop that eviction from happening, right? So sometimes there is a fire, and sometimes it's okay. Let's be creative. We have somebody who now has mobility challenges and they're on the second floor of a building. What might we do, right, to be able to keep them in that housing? And so with something like with that, we might have a reasonable modification, which is like a change to the structure of the building, where we advocate maybe they need a chairlift. Maybe it's that they can break their lease early and move to a first floor unit. Maybe there's carpeting that can be taken out so that their wheelchair can be more like easy to use on the floor. Like, so there's all sorts of ways we can be creative and problem solve that are within fair housing law. And so with the case, that somebody's like, well, I want to stay here, what can we do? We might have some more time to figure this out, and to work with other community partners and say, okay, can we get some funding for, a chairlift, or if it's a federally funded building, what can the landlord do or the property manager or housing provider do to make sure that this place is accessible for this person? So we get to like kind of work on it through a diversity of tactics, like whether it's advocating directly to the housing provider, potentially pursuing like a complaint at either like in Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Human Rights Commission. In Massachusetts, it's the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, or in district court or housing court or something like that too. So we have a lot of different choices of venues and like tactics that we can take. And sometimes it's just even calling up the landlord and saying, hey, I know you don't mean to discriminate, but when you're saying, no to this family because they've got a 6-year-old or, a 5-year-old, that's actually against the law. So what can we do to have you say yes here?
Or at least I didn't really start to think about how much discrimination there was against housing, against families in housing until I started to work in housing. And then I was like, oh yeah, people don't want kids around.
Yeah, no, it's really intense. And I would say in Rhode Island, we have some kind of like college communities where you have private landlords. So not necessarily the colleges themselves, but landlords who are, say, marketing to students. And there's actually a really cool term that originated from the UK that I learned from some Brown students and Brown University students that are working on these issues, called studentification. So like gentrification, but this the word student in front, meaning like some of these neighborhoods have really shifted to only housing students. And you can understand why economically a landlord might be into that, right? Like if they have 5 rooms and they can rent each room out for, $800 as opposed to renting a flat for, less and some, you can understand maybe why they would do that. But the effect of that is that even if it's legal to say, I only want to rent to students, you have to rent to a student with a child. So if you've got a single parent who's a student, at Roger Williams or Brown, and they want to rent a place and they've got a 3-year-old, by law, even if you're saying students only, that's a student and you need to rent to them. So there's definitely, some patterns that we see that I wasn't even aware of before kind of diving into this work.
Yeah. What are sort of common like fair housing barriers that sort of impact people? I feel like it's probably pretty rare that you'll see like a no African Americans or like something in a listing. So like how like what's the, like a couple examples or maybe any
Yeah,
archetypical example?
no, you're right. And I think some of this is regional too. Like racism in Rhode Island might look different than racism, say, in somewhere in the South, where it's still insidious and still happening, but maybe we're not as blatant about it, like you're saying, right? So instead, that's why we do fair housing testing, where we send 2 people who are going to have a similar profile, like make the same amount of money, have the same family status, but there may be of different races. And if we, send a white person and a Black person to both view the same apartment when they have the same economic profile, if the Black person is turned away for some reason and the white person is given like an application, we can look at that and say, okay, wait a second, maybe we have, racial bias here or race-based discrimination in this housing. And we have the ability to send, multiple testers to a place or to look at whole neighborhoods. And that's really one of the exciting things in fair housing world, is that we can get at some of this discrimination that isn't as overt, right? So it might not be somebody saying, no people of color allowed, but in practice, they aren't renting to people of color. And sometimes our testing can get to that. And then we can file a lawsuit to help challenge, that practice and say, actually, this is illegal, even if you're not saying these words. And of course, we still see some discriminatory advertisements. The exciting news in Rhode Island is the source of income discrimination prohibition that was just passed. And so we do see in Massachusetts, where we already have this protection, we do see ads that say no Section 8, even though that's against the law. Similarly, with houses, like older houses that potentially contain lead paint, sometimes you'll see a landlord or a property or a housing provider just say, no children under the age of 6 because, we don't know the lead status. And that's actually illegal to say too, but they'll put that right in the ad, which I think goes to your point of we need to get the word out more that this is actually against the law, because people don't know. And, if you're a busy parent and you're struggling to find housing, you might not take the time to say, wait a second, I think this is against the law. Let me go make a phone call. But maybe when you finally have some place to be, do give us a call or another organization, because that is, it's affecting more than just that person, right? We have a whole world of housing that's only available to certain people. That's not only wrong, but it creates these, pockets of, okay, families live in this neighborhood, other single people live in this other neighborhood. And that's, I don't think, healthy for any of us.
Yeah. Is there like a story, if it's not, maybe it doesn't have to be like of an actual
Yeah,
person, but sort of a like an archetypical story of like how you would help somebody through like a case or however you work?
sure. Sure. Yeah. So we get cases in many different ways. Sometimes another provider, like a service provider, will call us and say, hey, I'm working with this person and they face this. Can you tell me more about their rights? Or, we do some outreach events, less so in person during COVID, but in general, maybe we'll be tabling somewhere and someone will say, wait, what is fair housing? And we'll talk and they'll say, wait a second, that happened to me, actually. Like, I was told I couldn't have my service animal at this place. And so I had to move. I'm like, oh no, I wish you had known before. But there might still be a way we can address that if it's within the statutory period after. But it always makes me frustrated to hear like, oh no, this happened to somebody, and then they didn't know that it was against the law. But anyway, I would say, like, typical story is somebody, maybe comes to us and they're not sure of their rights, but something felt wrong. Wait a second, this doesn't, this seems like not right. And of course, some folks are very familiar with their rights and will say, this is a type of discrimination I experienced. But they'll reach out, we'll review kind of what happened. Maybe we have to gather other evidence, perhaps do some testing. If sometimes in somebody's gut, they'll say, I think this was because of my gender identity that I was told no. Like once the landlord looked at my ID and saw that my gender doesn't match my presentation, they told me, oh, I think I've already rented the unit. And the person's like, so they didn't say it was because of my gender identity, but I feel like that might be why. And so we can, test that place or potentially try to see if that happens to someone else, to say, yes, you were correct. Like, this was why you were, turned down, and that's against the law, even if, as you said, they're not, overtly saying it. And so then we can explore options. Sometimes someone really needs housing, and so they want us to advocate, even if, the housing provider originally said something discriminatory or told them no because they have a kid or something like that. We can still advocate and say, look, like, this person really just wants to live there. I know you don't want to be breaking the law. Like, what can we do to make this happen? They're ready to move in. They have their references, first, last deposit, whatever, they're a good candidate for these reasons. So we'll try to advocate. And sometimes if someone's faced discrimination, they don't want to live there, right? So that makes sense too. In that case, we can look at potential options, whether that's filing a complaint, writing a letter, something like that, to let the landlord know this was against the law potentially, and go from there. And of course, sometimes we do some more systemic work where we're saying, okay, we've seen this problem happening. How can we get at it? Like, for example, language access. If a number of people, or we think a number of people maybe who speak a language other than English, are having trouble, say with a specific housing authority or with housing authorities in general, we can look at, okay, is this a problem? Can we send testers to housing authorities to talk about, or to try to access, say, an application by speaking a language other than English, and see what happens?
Is it easier to kind of approach like institutional landlords like than like your maybe somebody who owns a triple decker and lives in the top floor? And is there like a distinction there, or is it just pretty much the same
Yeah,
type of work?
no, that's an interesting question. I would say, we've had really great conversations with people in different types of ownership styles and who own different amounts of buildings. And it doesn't seem to really be cut and dry, because even sometimes where you're like, hey, this big housing provider should know these rules, it's surprising when they don't. And sometimes we've worked with, smaller landlords who are really happy to say, oh, I didn't know that was my obligation. Like for sure, I want this person with a disability to have access to, their service animal, or to have a ramp put in or something like that. And so they're actually very proactive. So it doesn't, I think it's not like one type of landlord that discriminates. It's generally people who maybe aren't aware of the law, or sometimes don't value complying with the law, which is, that's when it's a bummer. Yeah.
Is there like a big success story that your organization has in the past like couple years? Like, it could be COVID related, but since everything last year was basically, but
Yeah. Well, we recently settled one of those student housing cases that I was mentioning in Rhode Island, where we looked and it was the same housing provider owned a number of buildings. And so we were really seeing this whole pocket of properties that were just being rented to students, which again excludes, families with kids. And so we were able to reach a settlement, not only for, a monetary amount, but also that they were going to change their practices going forward and do some intentional marketing to families with children. So whether that means, advertising at like the Y or a school or anything like that, or reaching out to local organizations, we're hoping that they are able to combat some of the discrimination that they caused by doing this kind of affirmative marketing. And specifically, letting us know like, okay, no families with kids applied, or yes, they applied and we rented to two or something like that. So we're hoping to have kind of an ongoing, a little bit of a monitoring situation to make sure that they are trying to undo some of the harm that they caused, which is, a bit of work for us. And for the other agencies, we actually filed that complaint with HUD, Housing and Urban Development, as opposed to a state agency. So HUD also had to spend resources and time looking at this. But that's, what led us to be able to settle, is because we, got what's called a probable cause finding, where basically this conduct was more likely than not like discriminatory.
And so as part of like the court process, was that sort of like affirmative marketing, like part of the negotiation of how?
Yeah, so we didn't actually go to like a court in this case because we filed with HUD. So yeah, they're an administrative agency. So sometimes they would hold like even a mediation, but in this case we didn't. We had more of informal conversations with the opposing side, and HUD kind of helped us structure a settlement agreement that both sides could be happy with. So we didn't, I didn't get to argue in court for this. We're always prepared to go forward with like a hearing or something. Often we're able to settle a case earlier, which is, kind of a win-win, because nobody has to then spend money to prepare and go to a public hearing or something like that. But yeah, it kind of depends on the venue for these cases. Like if you're in court, obviously you're adjudicating it there. But if you're in an administrative agency like HUD or the Rhode Island Human Rights Commission, generally it's going to be kept within that agency.
Is that similar if you're like reporting to the like Rhode Island Commission of Human Rights?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they're an administrative agency, so they're going to try to mediate the case, to work on a kind of an amicable, after they investigate, of course. So they're going to do a very thorough investigation, I should say, to make sure that there's just to see whether or not there's discrimination, use their resources to really explore it, and then if they find that there potentially was discrimination, they'll work on guiding a mediation. Yeah.
Interesting. You had mentioned the SOI bill that just got through the Rhode Island General Assembly and signed on last Thursday, which was very exciting for all of us.
Yes.
Because it's like been years of working on that, which is great. What other opportunities are there for like systemic changes? Like, is it mostly around awareness, or are there actual like areas where you think more legislation would be powerful?
Yeah, no, I think in the world of fair housing, there is a bunch that can be done more systemically. I made some notes, so because I think sometimes within our work, we there's so much to be addressed, like for individuals and for individual cases, that it's hard to think systemically. But the law, actually, the Fair Housing Act, actually dictates some systemic changes in and of itself. So something like affirmatively furthering fair housing. So this is part of the law, and there was a recent kind of rollback of it in 2018, but I think now we're back in action, where basically municipalities, cities, towns have a duty to really promote diverse and inclusive communities and expand housing choice, which means it's not enough to just say, okay, you're a city, you can't discriminate. They actually have a duty to make sure that communities are developing that are diverse, right? So that all the wealthy people don't live in one neighborhood and poor people in another, or people of color in one neighborhood, white folks in another. Like they have to report actually if they're getting federal dollars, this is what we've done to affirmatively further fair housing in our area. So I think that's something that folks don't often know about, that there is this duty to do that. And even though right now things are a little bit paused, that is something some cities, towns, and even states have looked at implementing on their own. And I know there have been some conversations in Rhode Island, both at the state level and at other municipal levels, about what is our obligation as a city, say, to make sure fair housing occurs, not just complying with the bare minimum, which is don't discriminate. Like, okay, like you can do that, but what can you do beyond that to ensure that people have access to safe housing that meets their needs in the neighborhood that they want to be in? And then, sorry, go ahead.
That was part of an Obama executive order. Is that right? And then it was paused, and then it got started back up again.
Yeah, so actually it was part of the 1968 Title 8, the 1968 Civil Rights Act. Yeah, okay. It goes way back, but there wasn't any, it was more of just like a please do it kind of thing. And so then in 2015, the Obama administration and through HUD said, okay, if you're getting federal dollars, you have to actually do this work. So that's when, cities kind of and states sprung into action, said, all right, we got to do this if we want our, money. But now it was, so that was through an executive order. But the general law itself still was already in play. But again, it didn't really have much of an incentive to comply. I still wish that people would, even if there wasn't a threat of losing federal dollars, right? But like if our value is to have diverse communities, even if there's no federal money attached to it, we should still do it, right?
Right, yeah, totally. And then what are sort of like the mechanisms that like a city or a state would use to like implement that? Is it mostly around marketing, or is it like actually make like helping people afford to live in spaces? Like what would like how would the rubber hit the road or whatever around that?
So some of it is removing discriminatory practices. So for example, in I think it was Philadelphia, there was a case where looking at eviction rates in the city, finding that many more Black folks were being evicted than white people. And so once you kind of know that information, okay, like, do you have an obligation to address this if you care about housing? So yes, you do, right? So actually there was a lawsuit and they're having to look at their eviction practices. So it could be something very specific like that. It could be also like looking at like exclusionary zoning practices, which again, this all gets kind of nerdy, but I think it's really important, right? Because the reason we have segregated neighborhoods in some ways is because we've put into law these barriers where we're saying, okay, this neighborhood is only for single family homes. And so what does that mean, right? It means that, if you're trying to build new affordable housing, what can you do? You can build 1 or 2 single family homes as opposed to a multifamily home or a bigger, apartment building with many units. And so certain buildings are prohibited in certain areas, which is just wild to me. Like we think, okay, we've undone, discrimination based on or we've made discrimination based on race, national origin, religion, et cetera, against the law. But because class isn't, codified, it's kind of sometimes a backdoor way to do the same type of discrimination, because we know folks of color are more likely to experience poverty. If you're saying no poor people in my neighborhood, what are you saying? So it really is like, that is such a direct way to get to it. And I know it seems like not super fun because you got to look at zoning laws, but to me, that's a way to really get at the heart of like who can live where, is to say, actually, we don't want to have exclusionary zoning practices. And in fact, some states, including Rhode Island, have looked at inclusionary zoning. So, okay, we want people of different economic statuses to live in our neighborhood. What do we do? How do we make that happen? Yeah, I mean, I think the diversity of tactics is important, right? Because I don't know the thing that's going to make change occur. So it might be looking at some of these nerdy zoning codes and advocating for change, which somebody with my skill set, like, great. And maybe someone else is better suited for leading that march and they, can work on that way. But I think we can all use the skills that we have to challenge some of these practices. And it could be something simple like, spreading the word about some of these, fair housing protections that are there. Or it could be something more, involved, like, okay, I'm going to attend my, city, meeting, like board meeting around like zoning policies and learn about some of these minutia and advocate for these changes. Even something like, how water gets distributed can often have zoning implications, and with that, some, implications about segregation. Like who has access to this new, water pipe system or not. Like, so there's so many different avenues, and maybe somebody with like an engineering background it would be great for them to learn more about how water is distributed, or something like that. And for someone who, is really good at organizing a meeting, getting some, other tenants together to talk about like, okay, what policies do we have in our building? How are we being, really like, how are we embracing disabled folks in our building? Are we being, accessible? Like those are great conversations to have. So really what I think, whatever the starting point is and whatever the skill set is, you can do something.
What's like really exciting? Like what's the most exciting part of your job? Like what gets you like pumped?
I mean, I think obviously when we have a win, like when someone's been denied housing somewhere and then, either wins their, files a complaint against the landlord and then prevails and gets a settlement that they're satisfied with, that's great. Sometimes it's just really exciting to have to validate someone and be like, yes, that was wrong, what happened, and like, here's what we can do. Sometimes someone thinks like, I just don't know if this is, was it me? Was it something I said? And so it's really, I think, having that moment where I'm like, no, it wasn't you. And actually what that person said was against the law can be really validating. And then also when we're able to connect with some more systemic work, like that's really fun too. When we say, okay, let's partner up with other organizations or other people kind of asking these same questions, that can be, a way to get some victories that maybe we couldn't do alone. So that's also fun, even if that's more of the long game.
Yeah, because I imagine that like a lot, like probably way more often than not, I mean, I'm just guessing, is that when somebody experiences something like this, and it's the same thing with kind of evictions too, where when they see some sort of sign of a problem, they just like avoid it and try to go to another space. And so like being able to say like, no, you like get to have a home, like
right,
is like so powerful.
Well, and that goes back to kind of your original question about like what home is, because I think, what would it be like to have that security, knowing that like if you did face like, an illegal eviction, that you could fight it and not jeopardize some of your future housing needs? Like, what would it look like to say, okay, we're building housing that you get to keep even if you lose your job, or even if, your roommate moves out, like to kind of have that built in to our, housing options, I think is really important. And so sometimes it's, if folks know their rights ahead of time, they can kind of take proactive action to say, okay, my landlord says like, if I, bring home the service animal, I'm going to be evicted. Okay, well, let's jump in there so that we're not too far, too many steps ahead where you might make the choice to move out because you don't want an eviction on your record, which I know great advocates are working on that issue too. But I can understand sometimes why people are like, I don't, I just got to move somewhere else. Like, I don't want to face this hostility from my housing provider. And so I very much understand that. And I think, sometimes it's trying to figure out what the problem is early enough so that we can avoid those kind of really hasty decisions, but which I can totally sympathize with.
Yeah. If somebody's just a random Rhode Island resident, like stumbles upon this and is like, oh, this is something that I agree with, how do I get involved? What would you suggest for a way to like take some action?
No, that's great. I mean, definitely I'll first, do a plug for SouthCoast Fair Housing, because we can always use testers. And so that we even offer some paid positions. They're very part-time based on our testing needs. But if somebody's like, willing to donate some time like that, or put in some time, they can actually get, some compensation for that. And so we would train somebody, and then they would, kind of, it's like secret shopping, where they go to an apartment, we give them a backstory, and they say, I'm here to apply for this housing, and I, have a 5-year-old daughter. I'm like, okay, like, are they not given an application? Maybe and then they write about this, and then they present it to us. And that helps us get at some of this, discrimination that isn't overt. So that's really important. And we can always use more help with that. And we have other volunteer opportunities too. If that's not someone's cup of tea, for sure, like whatever your skill set or interest is, we can figure out a way to put it to use. So we have a lot of great student volunteers, from different schools in the area, whether they're law students or undergrads. Like many, something that you might not even think of as a skill is probably useful, like might be translation, of some documents. So we can always use help like that. But then I think if even in just like first kind of learning about fair housing rights, like what are the protected classes? Like, okay, like as you were saying, a lot of people don't know that familial status is a protected class. So learning about those, like it's, race, national origin, religion, sex, which actually now federally includes gender identity and sexual orientation instead of just, in Rhode Island, we already had those protections, but now federally the Fair Housing Act is being interpreted to include those as well. So anyway, just knowing kind of what those rights are. And then Rhode Island has some additional protected classes, so things like age, military and veteran status, status as a domestic abuse survivor. Like those are all protected classes in Rhode Island too. So even things that you might not be aware of could be somebody's, ability to remain in housing or to fight an illegal eviction or something like that. So just gaining some knowledge and sharing it with friends, because it is always such a bummer when someone's like, oh no, like I left my housing because I didn't know that it was illegal to tell me that I couldn't have a baby, and be here. Oh man, I wish we knew about that ahead of time. So yeah, that's my long and short answer is knowledge, and then volunteer with us or other fair housing organizations.
And if somebody wants to volunteer with you, do they just go to your website?
Yep. So southcoastfairhousing.org, kind of a long word, and then .org. And then we have a tab for testers, and you can fill out, a form of interest there. Also, all our contact is there. So if you prefer to call or have another access need, we can figure out how to connect in whatever way works for you.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for talking. Is there anything that like we didn't cover that you felt like should be highlighted?
I mean, I guess I would just say that, doing fair housing work, like it can be part of, many different. So I think I would love to give a plug for if other, organizations are learning about this. Like we'd love to come talk to your organization, even if you just kind of do housing or you maybe work with some people who are applying to housing. Because I think, we get a lot of cases from whether they're caseworkers or, somebody who answers a phone at an organization, someone calls and says, who can help me with this issue of, my assistance animal. And it'd be great to kind of spread that information that way too. So yeah, we'd love to do trainings. We do trainings for all sorts of people. And so we can come to your organization or do it, virtually now, and kind of get into more of some of the details and like how somebody can, address the problems that they're having. But yeah, I love to talk. So please invite us.